All right. Well, I'm pleased that our next speaker is Abbey Wick from North Dakota State University. She's a state soil health extension specialist, does a great job working with farmers, not only in North Dakota, but across other parts of the country. So Abbey, we're really pleased to have you this morning. And I know you've had an amazing impact on farmers looking at various soil health management. So looking forward to your remarks.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I'm excited to be here. I've enjoyed the farmer panel this morning. It was a lot of really good information and yeah, just seeing what you guys are doing there. And hopefully I can add a little bit of content to that too, just on some basics of soil health and use of cover crops. So let's see, I need to share my screen and it's saying it's host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, I think Kelly will be getting you set up here.
Okay. Sorry, I could totally be doing something wrong. Everybody thinks they know how to use Zoom by now, but.
Okay, it says your co-host. Try again.
Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. Pull that up and then get into presentation mode. Okay, great. Thank you. So I wanted to start out just by showing the landscape up here because it is quite different from Missouri. And so you can see how flat the landscape is. And it's a great place to work on soil health, to be honest. I mean, we've got some major issues with using cover crops because it's such a tight growing season window, lack of cover in the winter typically, and high winds that lead to a lot of erosion. So there's a lot of interest in using cover crops in this region. It's just a matter of making them fit and for our climate. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today may not directly apply to what you're doing down in Missouri, but since this is a national audience, I think some of the principles of the approaches will certainly apply. And I want you to take away kind of the mindset of using cover crops. How are you going to implement them on your farms or your operation, whatever size it is, or how are you going to recommend these approaches to farmers to try them on their fields? So I think, one of the things that I emphasize up here, and I heard this a lot in the farmer panel, was know what you want to do with the cover crops. You don't know if they've succeeded or if they're achieving anything on your farm unless you know what you want to do with them. So typically we start out with this idea of, do you want to reduce erosion? So you can see these incredibly rich, high organic matter soils that we have here in North Dakota, especially in the Red River Valley. In this case, reducing erosion, getting some cover on that field in the fall, going into the winter where we can typically have open winters where we don't have snowpack and the soils are incredibly erosive at that time. Now, I think you guys have a lot of water erosion down there. Typically, if you can control wind erosion, you can also control water erosion as well. And then also we end up with a wet fall at harvest sometimes and a wet spring at planting. So managing the moisture is pretty critical. This year we also had a drought. And so trying to keep moisture in our soils for crop production was also a primary goal for a lot of farmers here. Breaking compaction is always a common goal, using something like a tillage radish to do that, where there's a lot of force behind that root pushing down into the soil. To break up those compaction layers from challenging planting times or harvest, or even when you're spraying mid-season and causing a little bit of compaction on the wheel tracks. Improving the seed bed. I think if you look at this clod on the right-hand side of this picture, that's actually from a field that was right next to the one where this other soil was collected. And that one had been, a moldboard plow had been used on that field. So we do see some of that still up here in North Dakota. And that makes it really difficult to plant into. I mean, we get a lot of freezing and thawing and wetting and drying over the winter that helps break that up and make it easy to plant into. But if you can do that with roots and with cover crops, then you're set up even better to create a nice seed bed. And then of course, this idea of a living soil. I mean, that's really something that is emphasized in soil health, and to have a living soil, you need to have food there, which comes in the form of cover crops. Leaving a field empty or void of any kind of plant is kind of starving those organisms in the soil, and we want to just get something in there for them to feed on and to help build their habitat. Typically when we talk about these goals, one of the ways to do it is through roots, through cover crop plants. And so these are just a couple different cover crops that are kind of popular up here that we use. And I really like this diagram from the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative down in Indiana. because it shows that the above ground biomass is oftentimes just as important as the below ground biomass in these practices and achieving these goals. So for example, if you're looking to reduce erosion, you're looking a lot at the above ground biomass. What can you produce to protect that soil? And then if you're looking at water management, you're looking at how much water can those roots take up and transpire from that soil to help manage the moisture. So, or how much organic matter can these roots contribute to that soil to increase water holding capacity. So it's both an above ground and below ground thing, which helps kind of too is thinking about these practices. What do you want to do and how are you going to accomplish it with something like cover crops? But I want to mention first that there's nothing that can save you. Cover crops can't save you from poor residue management. So that is always the first thing, even though we're talking about cover crops in this presentation. Residue management is the #1 thing that needs to be worked through when adopting any soil health practice. If you have a bad spread of residue, it's going to cause hairpinning and all kinds of issues of planting. And it just, even seeding a cover crop into that isn't going to save that situation. So working on spreading residue evenly, leaving residue standing and intact to the soil. So here you can see the chopping head was turned off on the corn head to leave those stalks standing and getting an even catch of snow over the winter. Also allowing for those cover crops to grow between that were interseeded, and just keeping that chopped residue off the surface from that mat that would form there that would hold in moisture is pretty critical when it comes to using cover crops in these practices. So typically, I think stripper heads are pretty popular up here in North Dakota. So running those through wheat and just leaving the residue standing is a great way to go when adopting any of these practices. And then you also need to think about what your current crop is and your next crop in rotation. And that may set you up for cover crop practices like this, where maybe you're seeding cover crops between the rows where you're going to plant your cash crop. In our case of corn up here, we can't plant corn directly into a living rye. Our season's too short, it's too difficult, the rye is too competitive with the corn up here. But some farmers will try seeding rye between the corn rows, or where they plan to plant corn as a solution to that. So knowing what your next crop in rotation is pretty critical in how you're going to get these cover crops on the ground and how you're going to make it the most effective way for your operation. But I want to talk first about this, one goal we have typically here, this moisture management where you have too much. So here's a side by side. The field on the left-hand side is actually tiled. So the water should be theoretically draining out that tile drainage to be removed from that field. But if that water can't get to the tile line, it's not going anywhere. And that's kind of the case in that field. And then to the right, we have a farmer that does not have tile drainage in their field, but they're using things like no-till to increase the pore space in that soil for water to drain. They're also using cereal rye to transpire that water once it gets growing, and also to compete with weeds. There's another goal to it. And they've also done a lot of ditching, surface ditching to get that water to move. So it may not look like it's moving here, but I will show you how it's working. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I could walk in that field. This is March for us here, maybe April, I don't know. Either way, I'm wearing a hat, it's cold. I think I have 3 jackets on at least. But I'm walking across that field with the rye on it because the structure is there to carry me across the field. And you can see here on the bottom left that my boot isn't even dirty. It didn't pick up any mud in that field. On the right-hand side, this is one step into that field that's tile drained that has not been using these practices. Not using a cover crop, they are typically ripping that field, which is causing some damage to the soil structure. So you can see how use of cover crops, a diverse rotation, reducing tillage has built up that structure enough so that I could walk across a field when it's that wet and it's a high clay soil. So I want to show you just examples of these practices working and the benefits to them as we kind of go through this. So as you're managing moisture, when you have too much moisture like we have in the spring, you also have that cover, which is adding the benefit of reducing erosion. So this field, not only is he getting in there to plant in a timely manner, he's also kept that field protected from erosion in this case. You also improve the seed bed. So here we are looking in that field at that seed bed and measuring the moisture content. The seed bed is really mellow and easy to plant into, but we're also building soil aggregation with all those roots that are wrapping around those soil particles and forming aggregates. which is helping with infiltration into that soil. It's also helping with regulating organic matter availability and mineralization into inorganic forms for crops to use. So we're doing multiple things based on this original goal that farmer had of managing moisture. And then we're also making it more manageable at harvest with using cover crops in these practices. So there isn't a cover crop on this field in the top left corner, but it has a history of using cover crops. It has a history of no-till and a short history, only 5 years. So the story behind this field, and I love showing this one because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, but this was in 2017 when they were combining soybean on the field in the upper left-hand corner. Combine was in 2-wheel drive. They were loading trucks on the field. If you go across the dirt road, the field in the bottom right is not using cover crops, not using reduced tillage, not using a diverse rotation. They were combining this field with tracks on their combine and loading trucks on the road. And so you can see how squirrely that path is. It was really probably pretty challenging for this farmer to get through and harvest. Both soybean fields, both harvested at the same time. You can really see the benefit of these practices working in these fields. And much to this farmer's credit here on the bottom right-hand side, he's attended a lot of soil health events. He's interested in these practices. He's looked at that neighboring field, and hopefully here in the future, he'll be ready to make some of those changes on his farm. And it's not just a one-year thing. This is that same farmer's fields in 2019, 2 years later, another confirmation that these practices are helping him on his fields. Use of cover crops again, diverse rotation, no-till. And so this field on the top is again tile drained just across the road. And you can see how that combine went through here pretty squirrely, had tracks, I think, on that combine as well. And then this is his field, and that farmer's field that I've been working with or learning alongside, where he's been, these are his pickup trail. He drove me out in this field and he asked if I was nervous, and I was a little nervous because I could see the standing water, and I know these soils are high clay soils, and I'd seen this, across the road, but no problem getting across it. It was something that you could really see the benefits of these practices for building up that soil structure. But we also have this idea of, having to manage moisture when we have too little. We do have some sandy soils here. They're not all that high clay, really dark soil. So in this case, this is a field that was wheat. A stripper head was used to harvest it. And back into that wheat, I think they seeded a oat cover crop. And so the reason they did oats is for flexibility of going to being able to terminate the oats if they need to go to wheat again, or that it will winter kill and it won't use excess moisture that they may need for the next year's crop. So they're going to catch a lot of snow with this standing residue from the stripper head. They've also got the cover crop in there to continue to keep that soil building and to continue adding organic matter to that soil. So their primary goal here, they're reducing erosion on this sandy field. And then this is what that field looks like. This on the right-hand side is the soil from that field that farmer had just taken over with that standing wheat straw. He had just purchased that quarter. And then across the road was a quarter he'd been managing for 14 or 15 years, where he was using no-till, using cover crops, short season crops on sandy soils. And just the color of that soil tells me that what they're doing is working. Increases in organic matter means you can hold more water for those crops. And that's how you do it in a sandy soil. You increase the organic matter. So these practices are working. They're achieving their goal of erosion control, but also increasing the organic matter for improved water holding capacity. And then, you have farmers that may use a tillage radish, right? This is a pretty common cover crop. I'm pretty similar to what was it? I think Kate was talking about earlier, not having complex mixes, kind of keeping things simple and economic. In this case where you're grazing, like she's saying, she could do a little bit more because of the grazing. But here these farmers had a pea crop on this field. They harvested it. They were planting a diverse mix of kind of whatever was in the shed. So you could see some corn in here. They've got some radish going on. I think they had 13 species in this, which is actually pretty uncommon for some farmers up here in North Dakota. We try to just get in what we can, especially if we're seeding it late. There's no sense in putting in an expensive mix because a lot of it won't grow. But in this case, they were in there early, got something seeded, pulled some old seed out of the shed. And it's a benefit of grazing it for their livestock, plus the radish in there to break compaction, adding diversity to their system, and also creating a habitat for a living soil. And this is pretty remarkable, the earthworms that you can find in these soils. Of course, there's all the small bugs in there too, but I think the earthworms are really the easiest indicator for us because you can see them. And then you can kind of predict whether they're going to be there or not only based on soil condition or soil health, but also on moisture and temperature of that soil. So again, achieving multiple goals with these practices. Cover cropping doesn't have to be complex to be effective. I recommend that farmers hear that they start, simple and add to it so they can see how those additional cover crops may help their system and achieve their goals. But if you're achieving your goal, there's room to play with it, but you don't have to feel like you need to be forced into more and more complex systems. Sometimes keeping it simple is the way to go. But clearly you can see that there are benefits, not only for moisture management, from using excess moisture, but also retaining moisture, to breaking up compaction, to creating, habitat for a living soil. All of these things tell you that these practices are working, and they're fairly visual, so you can see them on your farm. But the best thing that I think you could do, and everybody that was on that farmer panel mentioned this, is creating a network. Create a network of people that can share ideas with you, are using cover crops in their fields, maybe in a different way that can help you get new ideas. Work with your university researchers and extension, work with NRCS staff, work with soil conservation districts, certified crop advisors, agronomists. Anyone you can get into your network is going to be beneficial in using practices, especially if they're new to your farm, or even if you're recommending practices. I learn the most by going out and visiting fields and seeing what farmers are trying and doing. So lots of ways to learn and get information. But it's really important to build that network. And I think a lot of you are already doing that by attending this workshop today. So I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, because I think we'll have quite a few. Like I said, I probably won't give you any specifics for your systems in Missouri, because I don't know your systems as well. I just spent an hour learning about them, but basics on how these practices might help you are definitely something that we can talk through. This is the QR code for CEUs. For anyone that needs to scan it, we can just leave this up for a while. And yeah, Rob, I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was excellent. So yes, people, if you have questions, please type those using the Q&A function, and we'll work our way through those. So Abby, I have one to start out with you. You kind of talked about how each region of the country is different, but there are some common principles. If you were just kind of advising any farmer that's getting into cover crops and thinking about soil health, what should be the first 2 or 3 things that they think about?
Boy, that's a great question. I think one of the first things I ask them is why are you trying to do this? And oftentimes it could be that I've tried everything else, and soil health and cover crops is the last thing I can try. Or sometimes it's the first thing they want to try because they've attended a lot of meetings. And so, honestly thinking about what you want to do with them and then being very strategic in that approach. That would be kind of the first thing I'd have them think about. And then, think about your logistics. Every farm is different. Everybody has different amount of people that can get the job done. When are you going to seed this cover crop? How are you going to do it? Do you need to double up with another practice? Like, for example, for us up here, there's not time to seed a cover crop after corn harvest. So we can put on a cover crop at side dress time. So we can do 2 things at once. So limiting the number of passes on a field, the manpower needed to get these practices done, I think is a really important consideration. And, I don't know, the third thing, it's hard to, I guess I would just ask them also, how much have you learned about this? Where are you on these practices? What are you willing to try and do? But make sure that you have the background before you really dive into this stuff and to get some information. And that's what people are doing here today, which is a great thing. But ask a lot of those questions to make sure that you're familiar with what you're getting into.
Yeah, and probably start small with 1 or 2 fields, right? And don't be afraid to experiment with 2 or 3 options. There's not necessarily one perfect approach, but always pays to experiment, try some different strips of different cover crops and so on. So we do have a question in the chat or Q&A. area. And folks, if you have a question, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So there's a question: can cover crops eliminate herbicide use?
Boy, that's, in my opinion, the systems that I've seen, I don't like to eliminate any tool in the toolbox. I like to use them effectively and to limit the use and diversify in my use of different tools. So I would never recommend to a farmer that they could eliminate a herbicide on their field, or I just don't want to get rid of the tools in the toolbox. So I'm a little hesitant in that way, because I know that each farm is different, and they may have to go in and use tillage to work out ruts. They might have to go in and use a herbicide or stack their herbicides to manage a weed problem that they didn't intend on having, but maybe their neighbors had it and shared it with them. So I think there's always going to be something that you might need a tool for. So don't limit yourself on what you can and can't use, or where you're going to get to. But certainly if you're going to organic, you're going to have to think about that, how you're going to eliminate herbicides and what you're going to do to manage those systems.
Yeah, we do see some organic farmers certainly relying heavily on cover crops to help with weed management. Maybe not the only solution, probably still some other efforts. But okay, we've got a few questions popping into the Q&A. So the next one is, what kind of nitrogen programs typically are associated with oats and wheat in North Dakota?
Oh gosh, I wish Dave Franzen were here. He's the fertility specialist. I don't work a whole lot with fertility, to be honest. So I'm not sure I can answer that question and do a good job at it. So I'm gonna pass on that one. Sorry to whoever asked it.
Certainly, I'm sure more nitrogen on wheat than oats, probably, right?
I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here's one. How do you get farmers to try these cover crops on such large fields in North Dakota? And you do have some really large fields up there. So how do you get them interested in trying them on some of those bigger fields?
I think it comes down to the number of acres they farm. So a typical farm size here in North Dakota is 2,500 acres. So trying it on a quarter of land is not a huge deal to a lot of those farmers because it's a small percentage of their total acreage. However, I do work with some farmers who have less than 1,000 acres, and for them to take an entire quarter to try something on is a little bit too risky. And so we'll divide that field into a strip where they try something, or whatever their comfort level is. But honestly, it starts with the relationship that you're building with that farmer. So if this is somebody that's asking this question from the NRCS or another university person, or somebody that's working with farmers on these practices, I think you just really need to build that relationship and that trust that they be willing to try something on large acreage. But you have to provide the support, and you have to be willing to drive by that field often. I spend a lot of time, not even with farmers in fields, but driving by them and then texting them and saying, oh, this looks really good. That kind of feedback to the farmer is really important to get another set of eyes on it.
Okay, the next one is, do you have some best practices if you're going to aerially fly on cover crops?
I think keeping the seed size small can help quite a bit with that. So typically if we're flying something on, cereal rye would be the largest seed that we'd put out there. Other than that, it's kind of radish or something like that. So you want the seed size to be small. We certainly kind of look at the timing of when it's appropriate to fly that on. So I'm sure, the Midwest Cover Crops Council probably has really good guidelines on that for different states. There's places you can look for that information for timing. But yeah, I mean, for us up here, sometimes that's the cheapest way to try a cover crop, because it's between $8 and $10 an acre to fly it on for us. So if that's your gateway into using cover crops, and you're not going to go out and build an interseeder from scratch and whatever else, go for it and see how it works, and just keep your eye on it and learn from it.
Abby, I had a chance a few years ago to go speak about cover crops. There's actually a National Association of Agriculture Aviators, the people that you see flying around the fields all the time with fungicides and other products. And it was interesting. They said they do think it makes a difference that you find a pilot that has some experience with cover crops. They end up flying at a different height than they might for other spraying. They may need to adapt the equipment that they're using to broadcast the cover crop. And certainly they need some familiarity with what kind of wind conditions they can do it in. You don't want that cover crop to end up in the neighbor's field. But with corn, we do like to say there's probably a 3 to 4 week window to get it onto corn, kind of typically when those leaves start turning brown. With soybeans, it's tougher because, as you know, Abby, it's a smaller time window. So It's maybe about a week in Missouri. I don't know in North Dakota that when those leaves are just starting to turn gold, but before they drop, if we wait till the soybean leaves have dropped and then we try to fly on that cover crop seed, you're going to have it laying on top of all those soybean leaves and not too good a chance of germinating in that situation.
I've definitely missed that window up here.
Yeah. So anyway, those are just a few things. All right. Next one is, this is a little bit of a longer question. I have 2 small fescue hay fields in southwest Missouri, 6 to 8 acres each, which we allow a neighbor to cut for hay. We fertilize and lime. They don't necessarily need the hay, and they're thinking about transitioning to become more of a climate smart approach. Does it make sense to no-till cover crops and to fescue? We have a lot of tall fescue for pasture down here, Abby.
Okay, Rob, can you answer that question?
I'll try. So you can no-till cover crops into tall fescue if it has been, probably the easiest way to make that work is to spray it with glyphosate. Even then, tall fescue can bounce back. Kind of the recommendation if you're going to get rid of fescue totally in Missouri is you're going to probably have to spray it a couple times, maybe at 2 different times a year. You want it to be growing actively. You don't want to spray it in August when it's kind of dormant. So spraying it either earlier in the spring or in the fall when it's growing. And then we could come in with a no-till drill. Some of the cover crops are probably going to do better are some of the more vigorous ones. So if we use like a cereal rye, triticale, or wheat, those could get going, even oats, into the fescue in the fall. But you just kind of need to be prepared that that fescue may try to bounce back. So an overwintering cover crop will help suppress the fescue more than maybe something that just grows in the fall. And maybe a mix of cover crops like having a brassica in there, which provides some leafiness to help shade out any regrowing fescue could help as well. All right, let's see, we've got another one here. What's the best approach to terminate rye after soybean planting? So planting green, and this person says their background is they're seeding at a relatively high rate. It looks like around 80 pounds an acre. And yeah, so what would you suggest for terminating rye after the soybeans have already been planted?
Our primary option up here is glyphosate because we don't have time for it to get big enough to use a crimper. But maybe down in Missouri, you have enough time to get it large enough and enough moisture where you could use a crimper. So again, I don't know, Rob, if you guys use a lot of crimpers down there, or?
We see some and slightly growing use of roller crimpers. They're not really common. I would say larger farms are going to tend to chemically terminate the cover crop when they're planting green. So one person commented, are there ways we can kind of reduce glyphosate use? And I think there are farmers looking at some of these alternative termination options. If we let the cover crop grow long enough so that it gets into reproductive growth or starting to flower, then whether it's planting green or otherwise, we have some other options. We can, depending on the cover crop, mow closely to the ground if it's flowering. Now, if it's still just vegetative, you mow it, it's going to regrow, just like mowing your lawn. Some farmers have tried intensive grazing. That's tricky to get cover crop termination with. Besides roller crimpers, there's a few people that might use tillage, but of course we try to minimize that if all possible. So certainly the herbicide is the most common. Okay, here's a question. It sounds like Missouri is trying to double production. I think they mean cover crop production by 2030. It sounds like cover crops might reduce yields. So how does that impact acreage of our cash crops? So Abby, I'll just tell you while you're thinking about your response on that. In Missouri, we've seen that soybeans generally have either a neutral response yield-wise to the cover crop or a slight yield increase and more over time. So if we use the cover crops for a few years and we start to see maybe a 5% increase in soybean yields. The one where we've had some challenge, as you alluded to, is corn, especially if we're using cereal rye before corn. The rye can kind of tie up some nitrogen. So I always suggest not using cereal rye before corn, but if that's what you're using, to adjust your nitrogen management. But what are your thoughts on how cover crops impact yields and maybe avoiding any negative yield impacts?
The time that we see it impact yields is when people back off on nitrogen fertilizer up here. Like you're saying, that the cover crops can tie up some of the nitrogen, especially with rye. And if people are thinking that it's a catch and release system, for us, it's not that way up here. So you still need to apply fertilizer at the same rates, and we're working on those guidelines. But I think that's where I see the biggest things to watch out for with crop production is either you let the cover crop grow too long and it uses too much moisture, or that your nitrogen rates, if you decide to back off on them, then you can get hurt on your yield that way. So I hope that people do this on, like you're saying earlier, small acreage, get an understanding of it, see how much moisture it uses, how much nitrogen it uses, and kind of get your own, guidelines that are custom tailored to your farm.
Yeah, that moisture one is a key one. If it's a wet spring, you can certainly let the cover crop grow longer. If it's dry, you want to terminate earlier. So here's another problem somebody's asking about. Are slugs an issue in corn following cover crops? What's been your experience in your area?
I haven't seen much for slugs, but I'm pretty sure nothing likes to live up here. As far as pests, we have our fair share, but I think I think the cold up here takes care of some of those issues. But I have not seen slugs as being an issue up here.
So we put out some information on slugs and voles in cover crops because they can both be issues in certain spots. We probably in Missouri have a little more problem with voles than we do slugs, but even that's pretty spotty. It tends to be a completely no-till system. And it depends on how many predators are around. Vole populations are very cyclical. They can be really high one year and you think, oh, what do I need to do to control them? And then by themselves, they drop way off the next year, even if you do nothing. But voles are occasional issues. Slugs are pretty spotty through the Midwest. They can be bad in certain locations, but they definitely like residues. So there are baits that can be used, but they're generally not really recommended, both due to expense. Rain tends to reduce the effectiveness of those baits, and they're toxic to other organisms, including birds. So that's kind of a last scenario. Some light tillage is an option, but again, we kind of prefer to avoid that. So the key, a lot of the experts would say on slugs, is to look at your overall insecticide management. If you can have a bigger population, particularly of ground beetles, that can help over time manage the slugs because they're the #1 predator of slugs. And when we have insecticide coatings on our corn seed, those insecticide coatings tend to affect the beetles, either killing them or reducing their level of activity. John Hooker at Penn State's done a lot of research on this, and he feels that that's a key to be able to manage slugs. But it's not an instant solution. It's a 2 to 3 year solution, kind of cutting back on some of that insecticide use and getting more natural predators like ground beetles to deal with the slugs. Okay, there's just a comment here. I'm not sure if it's a question about Hagie high boys, which is one of the types of broadcast seeders for going through a standing corn or soybean crop. Oh, there is a question. It says, if we had more Hagie high boy seeders or equivalent, do you think more producers would be willing to adapt cover crops? In other words, they could be seeded ahead of harvest, maybe because, like you said, of the difficulty of following late harvest. So is that part of our solution going forward to getting over more acres?
I think there's certainly options like that. We've run around the countryside up here with the Hagie high boy to get some cover crops down. At the same time, we're side dressing nitrogen. What I found is that most farmers are in the shop chopping things up and creating their own interseeders. So I do think that there will be pockets of farmers here and there that will make their own interseeder or customize something with, I think, Rob, you've shown a picture before with a spreader box on the front of a corn head. I think there are farmers that are going to be doing that kind of stuff more so than going out and buying a piece of equipment specifically for, spreading cover crops, especially with that expense. But yeah, I see a lot of innovation out there, and then I see them upgrading that innovation. They have version 1.0, then 2.0, then 3.0. So yeah, I hope we see a lot more interseeding because I think it does work pretty well. And our main issue up here with insects is with crickets eating our cover crops that we put on as an interseeding practice. So yeah, we're gonna have to figure out how to manage that too, just like you're managing slugs.
Yep. Well, Abby, that was really wonderful. Thank you for all that great information you provided, and really pleased to have you join us this morning.